then, without further ado, I think we'll get started. Hello and welcome to the 64th episode of the Wagner's Nightmare podcast. Daniel and I are so happy to have Babette Babich on. Babette is a philosopher who has written on a great many subjects, including ancient philosophy and technology and aesthetics. She has worked in Belgium and France and Germany and England. We are thrilled to have her on today to talk about music and Wagner, of course, and the role of media. So I think that our conversation will serve to kind of explain more about that than anything I could say in an introduction. So I think we'll just get right into it. Thank you so much for being here with us, Babette.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre-Nicolas, and thank you also, Daniel, for this opportunity, and the fascinating notion of Wagner's Nightmare, which every one of us should be thinking about.
Right. So before we get into it, these more specific topics, some of the things that we're going to be talking about today include the themes of media or genre. And in your work, if you're going to write an article or give a presentation about media or genre, these are kind of two big words, but what are some what are some points of relevance for you with these two themes?
That's, that's an extremely difficult question because it means so many things to different people, especially today. When we're more conscious of it. But I, I would pay attention probably to the work of someone who really thought about Wagner in a strange context, and we forget him these days because we have a short memory. There are many people you mentioned Marshall McLuhan, whom we tend not to forget. Nothing like being in a Woody Allen movie to make you permanently part of the public consciousness. But that would be Friedrich Kittler, because Kittler has one of the most extraordinary analyses of how Wagner, in a way, becomes Wagner by the Gesamtkunstwerk and Kittler's analysis of a kind of mediatic transformation, which is really done, sight and sound, light and sound, by syncing the orchestra. So you already have a mediatic shift, because previously, and this is something that the analytic, I'm very not analytic, but the analytic philosopher Lydia Gurr writes about in her work, because one of the things that musicians used to do was make it up, do what they wanted, because they were on stage. Once you drop the musicians into the pit, you've already eclipsed them, which was Wagner's sort of specialty in life. So he was removing the performer in a certain sense from the center. And weirdly, he also did that to the singers, which is an extraordinary achievement when you think of Wagnerian lady singers, especially the sopranos, how you could do that.
Mhm.
But he did do that, and he did that by this total work and his vision, which was a vision, and Kittler analyzes this, that really creates a kind of ventriloquism, which means it's as if the earth is speaking, which, if you're sitting in the theater, is what's happening. You've got this, it's almost as if you were in a movie theater because the light's fully contained, the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, and then you have this design, and it's perfect, so that you're, as an audience member now, given over to what Wagner is happening, and you don't really know what you're hearing in a strange way, because of
Hmm.
course you can't see this. The not being able to see the musician makes it extremely difficult in an orchestral context. This is something
Right.
that continues to be a problem for this day when we don't see. And it's also why we love it when we can see. So special aficionados, I'm a great fan of Alfred Brendel. And if I am lucky enough to get tickets to any of his performances, then I'm going to turn into a music geek, which is terrible. And all of my boyfriends were better at it than me. They knew better. exactly where to be. And so I would imitate them and find that place. Why? Because I want to see his hands. So it's a very, very
Mhm.
important thing in order to see. How does that affect my ears? It's a very extraordinary, but it's crucial. And we've learned that also after 2 years of masking, that not seeing someone's, we didn't really need to know this because Piaget already analyzed it, but we need someone's face to hear them. And to hear them, that's one of the reasons it's very, very difficult to follow a solely acoustic podcast. It works in one way, that's the Wagner effect, because you don't see their faces. It strips information.
Right. And so coming from the outside, and we talk about the word, when somebody just hears the word media, we immediately think of like news outlets, but that's not really what we're talking about. And we're not really even talking about necessarily individual pieces of technology, right? Like an iPod or a computer or a Walkman or a radio. You're even talking about physical acoustic happenings, moments. A concert for you is a type of media, right? And I'm gonna kind of show the dust collecting on my mental shelf here, but it's either the McLuhan's working definition of technology or media that it's something that extends the senses somehow. So we have touch, vision, sight, and then hearing and all these things, and it somehow extends the senses. And so for you, there's the way that you're talking about it right now. There's very much a media is very. It's not necessarily electronics and kind of the internet and electricity and all these sorts of things, but it's very sensually related. That's the main thing that's happening there for you.
It's also, I think, that way for Adorno, and it's also that way for Gunther Anders, who was a sociologist of music. Although people didn't let him get heard because, as he points out, music and musicology are very privileged spheres. Getting a
Hmm.
voice, being allowed to speak, is extraordinarily difficult in musicology. Who gets heard, who doesn't? What I'm saying is there's a low tech, and that's the sounding board phenomenon. There's a low tech dimension which Wagner's using, and that's part of
Right.
his Gesamtkunstwerk. And Kittler, and he's looking at various types of media and analyzing simple things. Gramophone. How do you get to a recording, which is our standard understanding of media? And the reference, which I made earlier, before this began, which was to this very extraordinary analysis. I don't think I agree with the theorist after this insight, but it's just stunningly valuable to know what goes on with earphones, what goes on with with MP3s. Why should MP3s, which has a media, are probably the worst recording every so often. The famous complaints come on, and everybody has repeated these. What is the value of people who weren't musicians, who designed the acoustic recording capacities that we all inevitably use because they're ubiquitous? Why do we have this? There's audiophiles who have incredible equipment to reproduce, to get as close as possible to something that once used to be called high fidelity. Now,
Hmm.
Perfect Sound Forever, which was one of my first pieces published in a wonderful online magazine, Perfect Sound Forever. And they mean that. There are books on that with that title. How do you get perfect sound? And the problem, which is why I always go back to this reference, is that when MP3s are designed, they're designed in very specific ways in order to give you a kind of virtual representation of that experience of finding that perfect place to sit, to watch
Hmm.
Alfred Brendel. That is, you are then in a sweet spot for an audio, for an orchestra, whatever it's classic, and it's different. It's just the way you might in your Spotify search say, "Oh, I'm classical," and this is then, and you can modulate your own sounds so that you get that. But that's designed. There's no way you're clicking on something because they're sampling from various classical music recordings. Not at all. But these things, an engineer has decided that this should be given more bass, more attention to create the illusion of that three-dimensional space sitting in that concert hall. And it's so powerful that even though it's the worst recording device we have, we prefer it. If you put Hey Jude in your ears, you're going to be hypnotized. It's extraordinary. Because just by having this terrible MP3, you're going to be like Bruce Willis before he lost his speaking capacity, and you're going to want to give your iPhone library to your kid, and then you suddenly realize you never owned that in the first place. Because as Vandana Shiva, who's very smart, points out, it's rents. So that means anything on what we really mean by media, which is the platform, belongs to the person who hosts the platform.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Media belongs to the person who hosts the platform. That is kind of a funny way of thinking about Bayreuth um, and Wagner's festival. um, and especially so before Wagner came somebody like Liszt, who was famously criticized for the overly visual aspect of his acoustic concerts, right? He's a musician, and he was criticized for being overly visual for something that is supposed to be an aural event. And then you have somebody like Wagner, who, like you say, puts the pit beneath the stage. And so already going from Liszt to Wagner, you have maybe what you would call a pretty big media switch. And then eventually, after Wagner, then we find ourselves with recording technology, where the visual aspect is completely, completely taken out of the acoustic situation. Um, and so, does this, getting back to the question of Wagner, of genre, excuse me, um, Liszt and the virtuoso culture and genre, the visual element very much was a part of the genre, of this virtuoso genre, because Liszt was famous for his, in air quotes, three-hand technique that was actually developed by Thalberg. So where you had this problem where acoustically it sounds like there should be three hands playing. So there's this kind of discrepancy between the aural and the visual there that is very much a part of the genre of these pieces. Um, and then you have Wagner, who, in his effort to make the Gesamtkunstwerk, alters the media by sublimating the visual element of the orchestra, in an effort to try to integrate everything. And then you also now have recording technology that allows for the purely acoustic music, or yeah, purely. I mean, I say purely acoustic music because before there was this visual element of music. That being said, my brother is a composer, and he tries to, in his electronic music, tries to include a somehow visual element by manipulating the spatial perception of the sounds so that it still creates somehow a visual image through the sound. So if you could kind of say a little bit about genre in this way and the relationship between different media and genre, and keeping in mind that we're still somehow in the orbit of our of dear Richard, or not so dear Richard, as the case may be.
Oh, well, this again is an invitation to equivocation because unfortunately and I recognize there's a specific definition or role for the genre that's involved. And media is a slightly different affair. I mean, there's always the challenge, and even in the 18th and 17th, 19th, I mean, there's whole battles of this between tone painting. What is that? And it's something which Beethoven, and I'm terribly fond of Beethoven, like Adorno, because it's very hard to find bad Beethoven. Um, you can, it's sort of fun to go and look, but even then, if you want to focus on the bad Beethoven, it turns out not to be bad. So there's a very, he's an extraordinary composer in that sense. But he was, and this was a challenge. He was challenged for having things that were meant to be, and the same thing was true of Haydn. And you can kind of tell that I'm an old cellist because of the two examples I've just given. They're ones that go into that side. How do you deal with bringing in things that are kind of musical cheats, where you're bringing things that are perhaps non-musical into what is an idea of absolute music? And that is always a problem, because this is why it's still respectable, although I kind of admire Adorno for doing it, to despise Tchaikovsky. And you know, that's a fair thing. I mean, somebody already got there.
What's his line?
Bach.
What's his line exactly? It's hilarious. What's the line?
Pardon me?
What's his line? He has like a really pithy pot shot. That...
Well, I don't know if you can get a one-line pot shot, because Adorno spent all of his time talking about the fact that, well, this is not a reference to Boston, the Boston Pops. This was the whole problem for Adorno, was that you're making music accessible, which is kind of what people want now. And we're very much hoping, we aspire to be Tchaikovsky today, because that was apparently a wonderful age in which we would give anything, as almost Nietzsche would say, our eye teeth to give back again if we could. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But Nietzsche was talking about ancient Greece. We might want to be able to have the tremendous success of a Tchaikovsky in terms of popular sales and access to the public mind. That'd be great. If that, so that's not quite a one-liner, it's rather a sustained whine, because Adorno never stops complaining about Tchaikovsky, and you can wonder why. Not, I'm speaking of Toscanini, excuse me, but that's the problem of acoustics.
You complained about Toscanini too?
Toscanini, well, Toscanini was Adorno's problem.
It's my problem too.
But in, yes. And Toscanini had the success, but Toscanini, that's why I have the metonymic assimilation. Also, I just go by the first consonant and the brain stops after that. So Toscanini, Tchaikovsky, same thing. But not really, except with the 1812 overture, which was also kind of a easy favorite. One of the things that you're able to do is you bring in non-musical elements to talk about. You're bringing in war. It's almost like Benjamin and the hygiene of the mind, because you've got these explosions in the 1812 overture. You have these extra musical components, which have actually always been, that's why I refer to Lydia Gurr, a part of music always from the beginning that was never not there. Began with ancient Greek tragedy, which was also very musical, where the extra musical component was the sun rising. There's a beautiful book by Owen Lee called Athena Sings, which talks about how the ancient Greeks set themselves up in the mountain hillsides before the sunrise, so that by the time you reach the high point of the first tragedy, you'd have this full illumination. So they were Wagner thousands of years before Wagner. So it was, because Nietzsche's insight is it was sung. There's no way you're watching plays all day and all night, again and again. But if it's music, it suddenly makes sense, because all of it is, in fact, sung. It's like Tanglewood in the Greek highlands, so Arcadia and so on. But if you look at that, to go back to poor Toscanini, and which was the actual complaint that Adorno has, if you're looking for a pithy thing, it's about that. For Adorno, he's simply cheating, and cheating constantly in a way which recording makes possible and radio makes possible. So there's no way that you could really have the Boston Pops without the music, without the records. The records have to be produced, and those themselves require a recording studio, and those themselves require, which really part of what needs to be the analysis, what you reproduce at home. Today, everyone spends time, I get the right where they have an iPad, it's no longer an iPod as it was for Bruce Willis, but now we want to have a better phone, and we assume, we don't even pay attention to whether or not our earphones will work, even though the iPhones designed the earphones that would stay in your ear the least well, which are AirPods.
Hmm.
They simply
Hmm.
fall out. I'm trying to make these so they have wires, but if they were earpods, if I were very rich like Deepak Chopra, I would be constantly fiddling
Yes.
with, because they always fall out because of the jaw. So you speak,
I'm
they fall out.
I'm gonna go on record and say that I completely agree with you. Thank you for saying that. I don't understand how people keep those things in their ears.
You,
That's why I have
But
these things that snap onto my head.
watch Deepak. He's always fiddling because as he speaks, he knocks out his his AirPod. But there's also the shishi effect. It's the same way a woman can wear very high heels. If you know that you're beautiful because you're wearing this extremely expensive signifiers, as Baudrillard would say, rightly so, I think you're letting people know that you're doing well and you're in good shape financially if you've got AirPods. That may help.
Right.
I have no idea if it's true, but
you
you're
mentioned
flashing.
you mentioned the Boston Pops couldn't exist without recording, and this kind of ties into one of my pet theories. Pierre-Nicolas is probably tired of hearing this, but so I have this idea that um, classical music, if you're trying to define what classical music is, because it's a very real thing. When you say classical music, there's an image, a conception that comes to mind for almost everybody, but it also encompasses so many different genres across such a large breadth of time that are as disparate as rock and jazz and hip hop, like within the circle of classical music. So my idea is that classical music is music with a text that is interpreted and reinterpreted, and that um, it was sort of created in a negative sense by recordings, which allowed all these other genres, which were essentially um, acoustic, oral genres, orally transmitted, and now that you're able to record them, they can suddenly spring up and have become a massive business, and also develop canons and grow in depth and complexity because you can record. And now you have a sort of writing, a sort of text that people can study and build off of, instead of just being stuck with what one generation passes to the next. So this is an idea I have, that development through classical music into light as a thing unto itself. Yeah, so just throwing that out there. Maybe you have some thoughts on that. There was a second thing that, well, I'll remember it as you're talking, I'm sure. Go.
Great. Let me try, because as you were speaking, I was reminded of a master class at Juilliard. And David Darling was the faculty organizer, and he plays cello, so I immediately wanted to talk to him. And one of the things that he was sharing, because I'm at Lincoln Center, which is just across from Juilliard, and that's why I've taught there just once. I try to avoid it, but he said in his master class that the problem with the students who were auditioning was exactly what you were talking about, that they came in rather than this incredibly broad, there are so many ways, so many genres, so many performers, so many styles, and you could really, rather than any of that, they simply had a canonic text in quotes, a canonic recording that they wanted to play. So they came into the interview and they were playing to the recording, and that was the problem. So the text itself and the disparity of the many different recordings had just disappeared completely. Nietzsche has a phrase for this: the text disappeared under the interpretation. Now, what does that mean? That means that to a certain extent, at least for the student, this could be their life. You could decide their success or their failure, because when Darling, who is no fool, and who has his own experience as a performer, appealing to the popular ear, of course, that's obviously a thing. hard for cellists. Cellists have troubles, not as much as violas, but they do. Unless you have two cellos and then a lot of visual, and then that will help, and YouTube. But what Darling's point was that if the person who's at your audition hears that you're playing, and they will, to reproduce canned music, and they will, you're not likely, unless your performances, your gifts are so extraordinary, to get admitted. So there's the problem. And yet it's tremendously seductive. So in the Hallelujah Effect, and that's also why I have a blurb in the back of the recent release, Becoming a Rock Musician, which was written by H. Stith Bennett in Massachusetts, but not at any cool press. It was originally issued by the University of Massachusetts Press in Amherst. But he was simply saying, how do they do it? And my own students, I mentioned some of them, and I thank them, would complain that they couldn't read music. They couldn't read the original or text, which you're talking about. But they could hear. But the trouble is, when you hear, it's like Anna Kendrick with Cops, right? You listen to the same performance again and again and again and again until you've got it. So actually, we're way back with the ancient Greek bards who are hearing without the freedom of the bard to improvise. This is, of course, why I say maybe Darling let some of those slavish imitators into his program, but only if he saw special gifts. Because if they're just reproducing, that's karaoke. That's karaoke at Juilliard, and it's not going to work.
I think kind of getting to this question of media again, when and kind of when we're playing, what are we trying to do? And when somebody's listening, what are they evaluating us against? I think that kind of
Very fair.
tying in everything that you guys are saying here, um, when we say, let's see, how do I want to say this? I guess I could postulate that before the kind of text regime, as one of my former teachers likes to call it, um, you um, when you hear a performer, you would probably be evaluating their performance against other aural models, meaning other auditory performances, auditory experiences of the work. But now that we are comparing subtleties between the Henley and the Bärenreiter and the Vienna urtext and these kind of visual things, these are all visual things. We're evaluating when you talk about people that are just playing, that are reproducing, are they reproducing something that is aural, or are they reproducing something that is inherently visual in the end? And when you say that somebody is performing well or not, a lot of the times now we say that they're performing poorly according to the score, which is a visual stimulus, right? So that's again another kind of strange problem between this question of media and genre and the senses. Um, that I mean, of course, there always is going to be, some people will play. Um, the famous problem is that a lot of pianists play their Bach, and you can hear all the Glenn Gould influence that like he kind of set this aural standard. Like that's definitely an aural model, but um, in other composers, I can think of people are responding to aural stimulus with they're checking it with a kind of visual memory that they have of the score.
But I do want to jump in here. I mean, that relationship to the score and trying to reproduce it in an exact manner, I think there's a problem with that because um, there's a tradition of interpretation that people are taught. Right? Nobody knows how to read music; they're taught how to read music, um, and that there's many layers to that. So you can look at a Baroque score, but you've been passed down the tradition of interpretation that includes ornamentation, right? Which is definitely how you're supposed to interpret the text, probably, right? Or almost definitely. Whether you do so or not, that's up to you. But there's this tradition that's passed on. So an idea of exact oral reproduction of the visual thing, I think, is impossible.
But I hear what you're saying, but I think what I was thinking about was comparing somebody like Thalberg, virtuoso in Parisian salons of like 1830s and 40s, and this supposed person that's auditioning at Juilliard in the late 20th century, early 21st century, um, and how those two performances are being evaluated. And quick plug for my dissertation, this is kind of what I talk about, that like the Clara Schumann and Joseph Joachim and Brahms are very responsible for the evaluation of a performance becoming that you're owning up to the composition itself, and you're being evaluated against the composition as a performer rather than your own qualities as a performer and a instrumentalist, which is something that I think was more prevalent before the obviously you can find examples of just about anything happening at any moment, to kind of provide counter arguments, but yeah, I think that that's definitely a part of it now, in this relationship between media and genre.
I think there's also a difference at a student level. I mean, so you're quite right, and that was the early 21st century. It's not that old, David Darling. But it is a student difference, and it requires an expert to hear. So it wouldn't be necessarily something that the average person would hear. But you know, he's playing to the CD. It also tells you the dating of that, and that is early 21st century, because at that point you still have something fetishizable, and that's really also what people are looking for with a new NFT. Would be something fetishizable. So you want to get something that's a token that you can hold on to and pass around and have, and maybe, unlike poor Bruce Willis, this is his third mention, you'd be able to bequeath in a will to heirs, something that you could give, and that would be that's really, so it's replacement. That's still a score. That's, or rather, not a score, but it's still a text, better said, which is the CD itself. That is the problem with it. And of course, the problem with CDs is that they are completely volatile. Anything digital is. None of them last.
What do you mean by that, about digital being volatile?
Digital creep is what it's called technically. And it's a problem. I was, for a brief time, a chair of a library committee at Fordham, and I take these technology things terribly seriously. So I think about them. I don't just say, well, we shouldn't. And one of the problems is when you store a dissertation online or any book online, is that after a while you'll have the NASA problem with various the recordings and the tapes that they have from the 60s. None of those are readable. It's not a matter of not having technology. It's a matter of it's a magnetism problem. And the same thing is true also for light and anything that's really going to be readable and require a kind of change. It's a great problem for people when they're getting rid of computers. How do you render your hard drive unreadable? Well, the fact that you can is the problem, because over time they will all be unreadable.
So digital stuff has the same issue that paper does.
Well, paper is far more robust. Really? When I was in Tübingen, I read, and in Basel you can go, and you can go to the library, and you can take out, and they probably have them on the shelves, books that are 300, 400 years old. They're not in archives. They're sitting on the shelf. If they haven't fallen apart and someone has decided, oh, they must be handled with, with cloth gloves or silk gloves. But otherwise, paper survives fire in many cases. It's extraordinary. But as a form of preservation, it is better than anything we have today. It is better than any kind of digital, because the digital simply means, this is why I have I have millions. I'm a photographer, and I have millions of these silly smart cards, lots of them. Also have the bigger version when I started. I don't reuse them. And I don't reuse them because every time you download it to your computer and you call it up again, it's being resurrected from the dead. It's reconstituted. So if you're looking for that fidelity, whatever that meant, it's not there. And after a while, no photographer will do that. You want, and I'm not that quality a photographer, but I do that to keep myself mindful of this fact rather than as we are casual, because it's dangerous, I think, that we simply don't care anymore. We don't care that the pixels suck. We don't care that the sound we're hearing isn't really that good. It's so close to the bone. It's so close to our head. The skull candy metaphor that will sell our soul. It's a kind of Goethe problem. You know, we don't mind. The music is there for us. So I think it's the fact that this particular media is so opaque. Adorno was talking about radio. Arnheim talks about radio. Brecht talks about radio. Anders talks about radio. Now we've got things which are not even with the fidelity of a radio orchestra. I mean, you actually can feel bad. Same kind of sympathy for Toscanini. Can we get one of those orchestras again, which is redesigned? How many members can you fit in the studio? So they changed how you would have to have an orchestra just to be able to deal with the recording components, constraints.
Yeah, and I think so. A trend that we're kind of talking about here is if we take 200 years ago in European concert music culture as our starting point and kind of going toward to today, shifting from different media and different this and that, there's a general sublimation of the visual component and going just to the audio. And then now you're even saying that the audio component tends to be getting lower and lower in quality. In terms of the fidelity, right?
Yes,
and
whatever that means. Your teacher would not like that comment.
And so if we kind of take it to today, and the hottest buzzword on the scene being NFTs in terms of media and new formats, the NFT itself is sometimes not even the actual audio itself, right? It's this non-fungible token, right? So would you even consider it a form of media yourself, from an artistic standpoint? If it kind of represents something, if it's something that is a token in a transaction, and something that has a sort of acquired a value. Yeah, there's this kind of trend here if we think about, yeah, that I kind of outlined. Have we kind of have things just kind of disappeared into the, for those just listening, I'm wiggling my fingers here. I think into, yeah, what do you think about this?
It's such a difficult question because there's an awful lot of hand waving, and that's the problem with NFTs in general. So when I was talking to Jordan Kokart, who has this project, very important project about the possibilities of transmission of ether, of how you have an experience altogether. And I'm stunned because that we believe this is because we simply take the YouTube for granted, especially after 2 years. But I think even before that, because I think we were already taking it for granted. We were already getting together with friends around or a family and dinner, and we would bring out iPads or other terrible forms of reproduction with bad speakers, and we would produce music from the YouTube that we could get instantly, faster than any, if we had a CD collection, didn't matter, record didn't matter. This would give you right away the sound that you wanted so you could illustrate your point or prove a point and or hear something or be moved. Then 2 years of a pandemic changed in a weird way for a second what classical music could do, and then it vanished. That passed too. But you had this window of moment where people were moved and it was a great experience, but it involved desperation rather than money. So people needed something to cheer them up. They needed some kind of community, and the virtual, which is a lie, always important to remember that, provided that for people. When you say goodbye to someone dying in hospital by iPad, you weren't there. They weren't there. They died alone. It was a lie. Because at the end of the Zoom conversation, that particular moment,
Right.
which gives you that Sartrean thing of the entire world going down a drain into, and what does that do to your psyche? Where are you? How do you handle the rest of your day? And as a teacher, that's all I do. So it's like brain damage, 101. So you can't get away from it. I think the problem is that I'm reminded as you were speaking, because my sister, when I was very young, used to listen to the Moody Blues, which was good because it's always good to have a sister who listens to the Moody Blues if you're classically minded. They were pretty classical anyway, but they had album covers. And so what you really have is an album cover for the New Age, which has nothing else but simply plays on cyber currencies, and the cyber fascination that we have is something that we could perhaps invest in. And some of the challenges of Bitcoin, all things are blockchain, which are poorly understood. I mean, I work on Heidegger and Adorno. Those are very recondite thinkers. They're hard to understand. Almost no one in philosophy, as far as I understand, fully understands blockchain. There are plenty of people who explain it to you, but no one fully understands it because you're talking about something that really requires that you persuade an audience that it actually has value so that they might invest in it.
Right.
It's a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
So
100%. I think that I yeah, I agree with a lot with what you say. And
I'm
but
interested
one
in
of the
what you
things
don't like.
I'll just say very briefly because I know that Dan has a quick reaction. Something that I have kept in mind. Last conversation that we had for our podcast was with a composer who has released um, and releases a lot of her music through NFTs. And one of the great things, as you were saying, that we take YouTube for granted now, one of the things that I've kept in my head from our conversation is she says that this technology, we're not going to talk about it the way that we talk about it now. Like in 10 years, in 5, 20 years, whatever, because she said, nobody says, I'm going online anymore. And like 15, 20, 25 years ago, that was like, I'm going online to do this. Um, and so that is one thing that I was thinking about, and another thing is as we think about NFTs and kind of what it is, what it will be, what it means, all these things. I'm often thinking about the birth of cinema and that technology, and the fact that when the huge jump between the actual invention of the technology for motion capture on film. Um, and that whole hunt and the players in that and the Frères Lumière and all these things and the actual industry of Hollywood, which is nobody was thinking about global cinema when the technology was invented. So that's kind of something that I'm thinking about as this whole NFT situation plays out, that it will develop in one way or another, and I definitely feel it as a sort of personal responsibility as an active musician today to sort of have personal experience with it myself as it inevitably continues to develop. And I think that that's kind of why Dan and I are part of the reason why we're so interested to get our hands on it. And I'll kind of let Dan tag on here.
Just as a quick response to that, I agree. Nothing what I'm saying is reality, but I don't think that should stop you at all. I think I encourage everyone to get into NFTs and to use them, because after all, you wouldn't issue an album without an album cover. So being clear on what it is, and those then are auctionable and have extraordinary worth today. So there is something that you do need that non-fungible, but you do need the token part of it, and you need something that is tradable in that sense. Just the way album covers or comic books. That doesn't. I'm just trying to keep a certain perspective, but I don't disagree at all.
Of course, of course. And we've kind of reintroduced the visual element, by the way, as we talk about album covers.
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good that the media still has a way of accounting for the visual component. Dan, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, this wasn't my initial thought, but I mean, you mentioned album covers, and I mean, we really think of recording as a different medium than performing. That, like, it's okay to have a recording and make a recording, and that's fine, but it's a different thing than the concert. You're not just trying to replicate it. Like, we're fine making all kinds of cuts and creating an experience that never existed. Like we say, the album never happened, right? But we're fine with that. Like, we respect it for what it is and think it can have some value unto itself. But just moving aside from that thought, I wanted to mention some Benjamin themes, which I think are relevant to both Wagner and NFTs. Benjamin writes about the cult, and then, art for art's sake, the theology of art. And you mentioned the people tolerating worse and worse sound quality, and recordings are more ubiquitous than ever. You can get them for free. You can listen to almost any recording of any piece for practically nothing. But people still go to concerts. So there's this massive mechanical reproduction of art. This is what Benjamin, that's the theme of his famous paper. And at the same time, and he says the reproduction kind of undermines the cult, the sort of sacred experience that you could have, the communal experience. It just creates this commodification of art. And that happens, but at the same time, people are always finding ways to still keep the cult. People still go to concerts, or they'll find ways to, whatever kind of artifice they need to make, a movie. He complains a lot about movies doing this, but now we go to movie theaters and we still have that experience that is different than watching a thing on your computer. So there's always ways of recreating the cult, and people have, I think, a real need for that. And this was Wagner's big thing. Like, the Wagnerian project was to create, in his case, probably literally a cult, but kind of have the sacred experience when he saw or felt that religion was decreasing in Europe, still providing what he thought were the personal and sociological values of religion through his art. But getting into NFTs, so you probably have a response to that whole chunk of thought. But NFTs, they limit mechanical reproduction. Like, that's the idea, right? That you can create something that's non-fungible, non-reproducible. And whether or not that works is subject of debate. And then there's also this, the ethos surrounding NFTs and people working with blockchain and Web3. It's all about decentralizing and breaking away from the culture industry. And I'm more skeptical that will work, actually, than that the NFTs work in terms of creating some sort of scarcity for, music or image or whatever. But I threw a lot at you. You might have some thoughts to all or none of that. But
I wish I could solve the NFT problem. I think the world wishes that, because I actually meant what I said, that I think it's great that you're doing it. What made me so excited to join today was the fact that this is something that you're thinking of doing. And I think that to a certain extent is an inevitable part of a certain future. That said, my late husband Tracy Strong, I have his book on my bookshelf, who wrote Nietzsche and the Politics of Transfiguration, wrote that as a dissertation at Harvard, so also Boston. And he listened to all of Wagner's operas, seriatim. I don't know what kind of stereo apparatus he had. It was in the 60s. He was part of SDS and so on. When Stanley Cavell first came there and so on. So they were, which is another musical name in philosophy. So there is a Wagnerian connection that is perhaps an illuminating one and that one should bring up. But in reference to the previous comment about how the future, which was, of course, Pierre-Nicolas's comment, experts will say that things change. We don't say that we're going online, and we don't, because now the corporate culture has taken over. We're on Zoom. It's like talking about video conferencing. I just did a YouTube thing, which is very painful because he insisted on putting subtitles, with someone who constantly called it my text a video conference. I talked about Zoom, that we have the Zoomification of the university. He said, no, it's video conferencing. And I'm like, what is your problem? And I realized he's very old. And for him, it's like talking Xerox instead of speaking that you're making a photostat or a photocopy, because you've taken IBM, Microsoft, Apple, you've taken these logos, these personifications, far worse than the visual insinuation of aura, and you have put something which is always going to be paying those rents, inevitably. And that's why I was trying to mention Jaron Lanier's point, as he is also a strange musician who is also very familiar with online technology, media technology, musical technology. And one of the things he insists on is that this is nobody's working. There are no dwarves somewhere. They'd have to be in Zurich, not Basel, who are working on making this technology better. This is the most extraordinary thing. It's not getting better. It's like when I first got the program for Mist, which I thought was fascinating. And I said, these are terrible graphics. These are the worst graphics ever. And then I got friends, because my brother used to design games with online gamers and so on, and I teach it in my technology classes. And the graphics are still terrible, but we've gotten used to bad graphics and we love it. So the new design, it's like compiling in general when you program. No one really learns machine code any longer. What you do is you work with automatic programming that just works with the same garbage and piles more stuff on top of it. No one ever fixes it. That's something very, very worth thinking about, because the revolution in music that has to happen, and I'm not going to be able to do it, really would be to have the answer that Tracy, my husband, used to quote a member of the Guarneri Quartet as saying to him, the worst live performance is better than the best recorded performance. It's a beautiful phrase, and he heard it straight from the man himself. But I think that as a very successful member of a very successful quartet, who had tremendous success at Guarneri, after all, it's almost a household name, you have an advantage. So that the live drops, how can we get back to finding a way? We capture the live. Then we're back to our original Wagnerian moment in Bayreuth, when Wagner himself was there and he sings the orchestra.
You're muted, dude. Oh, you meant to be muted. Cool. Okay, so suppose I'm supposed to keep this wonderful. Oh, he's back. He's not
back. Smooth one, Daniel.
Well, it felt like a good place to stop, and you're usually the one who kind of closes us out.
No. I think, yeah, I think as the final kind of closing question here, you mentioned this kind of Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I just got thrown off because my roommate walked past me, and I just had to ask him for 4 more minutes of yes, of time in this room. Um, Dan, could you just
Yeah,
take over for a second?
I can take over for a second. Um, well, I no, I really think that is a great place to leave it off. You tied it all back into Wagner, and I agree. I think there is value in recordings that they can be artistically substantive, but a live performance it's just something different, and it is on the whole better and something that we really need, and it's good that people still go to them and that it still happens. And I think that classical music in particular really is only it only is what it is in live performance. You know, it kind of loses its identity without that. And that raises a whole other thing with like the relationship between media and genre. We don't necessarily need to dive into that, but when there's different medias that get developed, it leads to different genres uh, being developed on top of that that didn't exist before. And medium also, you know, it kind of messes with pre-existing genres. Like, oh, classical music has to adapt and become all sorts of things that it isn't, and maybe people's consciousness changes because of the technology around them. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff, but we still have live performances, and I really, you know, there's a lot of problems with recordings, with social media, with YouTube, um, and at their best and their worst, they are kind of default to advertising for live concerts when it comes to classical music, which is really a shame for, you know, like we can't make money off the stuff we're putting out there. But people also intuitively recognize it's not artistically substantive and that they should go hear the real thing. So there's some good and some
Yeah,
bad in that.
and kind of piggybacking off of that, that you mentioned kind of the revolution in music that needs to happen. This is kind of something that I also spend time thinking about, and I find myself in a bit of a paradox here because on one hand, I think that one of the things that needs to happen in classical music is to kind of downsize just about everything we're doing. That um, again, talking about media and genre and the relationship between the two, when something that I think is very overlooked is that when we talk about the concept of the universal in Beethoven, Beethoven was not thinking about Australia when he was thinking about the concept of the universal. And in classical music now, we think about like Seiji Ozawa broadcasting his his recording of Beethoven literally into the universe, you know. And so there's this kind of weird thing that like we think that this music needs is this global thing, but it's um, originally it was not a global thing, and it's something that is based in live performance. So I kind of see this downsizing that needs to happen, but I'm also interested in using this technology that is very globally oriented. Um, and people point to, oh, the success of NFTs can be substantiated by the fact that even Nike and Sony and Deutsche Grammophon are using NFTs now. And I'm like, no, like that's the sign that it's not gonna work because all these people are getting involved. Um, so it's this weird kind of paradox that we find ourselves in. It seems like from this conversation you seem to be sensitive to kind of the necessity of exploring it, but also keeping both eyes open as to the things that are potentially putting more fuel on the flames that are already threatening us.
It's kind of a problem. That's the reason I mentioned the unknown person. Adorno's very well known. Anders, who was colleague, was not as well known. He was Walter Benjamin's cousin, and he was Hannah Arendt's ex-husband. And he wrote these giant texts on music. But what's a takeaway? You want to just a quotable quote? Is this in der Musik sein, to be in the music, and gave an analysis of that, which for him also apply to the listener. And I think that the reference from performer to listener, zuhören, that there's an active hearing, and it's usually only someone with musical background who's really going to, he argues, be able to do that. But there are those who are also with an experience only as a participant. And in German, they have an unkind word, which is Gönner, which is somebody who just sort of like kind of gushes with enthusiasm for any kind of musical event. Those are one's fans. And that's what you want with NFTs. And that's also what you want, because that's what gives that incredible dynamism at the audience.
Right.
Those fans turn into Wagnerians at this extreme, and then it's something else. So that's like that wonderful little humor book produced by Wagnerians. They have a good sense of humor. Wagner und kein Ende. So no Wagner and no end. There's like no limit. Limitless Wagner. Wagner forever. Yeah. We would say, as Make America Great Again Wagnerian types. But
sorry, I found the Tchaikovsky quote I was looking for.
Thank you. Okay.
Maybe we can share close. It? Yes, I think it'd be the perfect way to end.
Yes, thank you.
This is what Adorno said about Tchaikovsky. Oh shoot. No, I lost it again. I found it. Is there not a strong likelihood that they listen to it as they would to a Tchaikovsky symphony? That is to say, simply listen to some neat tunes or exciting harmonic stimuli. Neat tunes and exciting harmonic stimuli.
Very Adorno. Most people won't even notice that he said something mean. It's like the Galgenhumor, the German, the gallows humor, where someone complains, was being executed. He's had his head cut off, and he says, "I don't think you did a good job." And the henchman says, "Bend your head. Nicken Sie mal." Adorno is like that.
Well, I think with this dark humor that is kind of slightly absurd, that's the perfect way to wrap up this episode of the Wagner's Nightmare podcast. Babette, it has been such a pleasure to kind of get lost in these fantastic, curious, and very relevant topics. So thank you so much for your time. And I'll just let you have the final word. If there could be one article or book of yours or some sort of way that people could follow up if they want to learn more about Babette Babich after listening to this podcast.
Well, probably the Holloway effect, but for this podcast, I would prefer the Gunther Anders philosophy of technology, because that, or just a short piece on Herbert Aymet, who was an electronic composer who composed a poem that Anders buried in a footnote in his book that he wrote in 1956. So I would say that essay would be Akichi Kubayama, a wonderful way, epitaph for Akichi Kubayama, which is also Cologne. So a very interesting way to kind of pull together some of these disparate themes that would bring in media and genre. And I'd be happy to share it because I'm happy to give away PDFs. It's a great challenge in philosophy. Can you give it away? That'd be the difference between philosophy and music.
Which we will talk about on our future episode, perhaps. With all right. Well, thank you once again for having us. Please get in touch through our website, through various social media stuff, or the people that listen to this probably have one of our phone numbers, so you can do that as well.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Pierre-Nicolas.